Hello, Earthlings and humanoids. It's Adam and Akbar. Say hello, coming at you for our 8th lecture in Ethics and Science, Philosophy 2600. This is the beginning of Module 3, talking about what is science here. And Akbar is super excited because he's a big science geek, so he's looking forward to this one. Let's get into it here. Here's what I want to do today. Our objectives basically are in this lecture is to overview Module 3 briefly, and then to take a analytic view on the question, what is science? And give you some answers to that question. So we'll start with some examples to have something concrete. That's the way I usually like to learn about things before we get abstract with definitions and demarcations. And then we're going to have 9 ways of seeing science. Talk a bit about relationships between science and other parts of modern culture. And then we'll bridge into the next lecture briefly with the talk about norms in science. And we'll talk about epistemic norms, or norms about the generation of knowledge today, and kind of just mentions ethical, social norms, because that's going to be our topic next time. Yeah, and speaking of that, actually, here's Module 3 in terms of what I want to talk about. You see in the syllabus what you're reading and what you're watching. This lecture is going to be analytic. That is, I'm going to try as much as possible to bracket off history. It's hard for me to do because I think history is so important for the way we think, but it's also important sometimes to be analytic and just make distinctions. And it's going to be very broad. And then we're going to focus on Robert K. Merton's The Normative Structure of Science in the next lecture. Walk through that. And then after that, a couple of lectures, one on, we'll go back and look at science in history and the development in particular of these norms a little bit. And then we'll have a talk about science in a democracy. Okay, so get into it. Now here's these examples I wanted to start with. Which of these is the scientific definition for what you're looking at here on the screen? It's a part of giant Ymir's skull. It is, you can read through this, that there were 4 dwarves holding up the skull aloft above the earth. And what you're looking at is the flake of this skull falling from the sky and disintegrating. Or this one, an icy small solar system body that when passing close to the sun warms and begins to release gases in a process called outgassing. And then you can continue on to read it. Of course, you know, the second one is what we would consider a scientific explanation or description of this phenomenon. Why is that? Well, in the book, we talk about science as a non-narrative rationality that attempts to describe and explain things by appealing just to nature, physis, the things themselves, and logos, the logical relationships between the things, rather than a mythical or a narrative form of understanding that creates stories with these supernatural actors. Or consider, why does a leopard have spots? Or how did the leopard get her spots? I'm reading with my daughter Rudyard Kipling's book of Just So stories, and in that book, the explanation for that is that the leopard was out hunting and having a hard time of it, and an Ethiopian that he was hunting with gets some dye or some paint and puts it on his fingertips and paints the leopard, and that's how the leopard got spots. Scientific explanation would have to incorporate evolutionary theory, right? That this has to confer some sort of fitness advantage to the leopard. Maybe it's camouflage or something. And then, of course, the genetic reproduction and inheritance of this trait down the lines, right? Different ways of talking about how the leopard got spots. Now, if you said to Rudyard Kipling in his Just So story, prove it to me. How do you know that's how a leopard got spots, that somebody painted him? It would be probably impossible to do, but if you started out on the path of trying to prove or establish how it is that you know that and why what you know is warranted belief, then you're starting on the path of science, right? Finally, this last one, science, I want to at least make an argument, isn't the only way of accessing truth or of reality. The reality disclosed by science is not the only reality. The truths arrived at by science are not the only truths. They are important, of course, and in many ways, science does have a privileged access to truth and reality. But if you were to ask, what is a tree, of a scientist, you get a different way of talking about it in disclosing that phenomenon, describing it, than you would of a poet. This is William Carlos Williams, his beautiful poem about the Botticellian trees and how the alphabet of the trees is fading in the song of the leaves. I love this one. A poetic description, I want to argue, also has merit as a way of helping reality shine forth to us. So I don't want us to reduce everything down to science as if it's the only way in which humans interact with or understand the world or come about having different kinds of truths, right? But science is clearly a very important mode of inquiry and a way of accessing truth. Okay, so those are some concrete things to keep in mind. A comet, a leopard, the trees. What is science? So for those of you who want to just hang your hat on some definition, well, how about this? The intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural and social world through observation, experiment, and theory. I think that is a pretty good definition insofar as we can nail this thing down that we're talking about. Science is this practice, this attempt to explain what exists and why does it behave the way it does. So to describe and explain, maybe control the world. Okay. One of the important things, and this is kind of crazy to have one lecture on what is science. You got to realize people spend their entire PhDs trying to answer this question. It's a philosophical question that has deep and long roots, and we're trying to just give it a broad brush here. One of the things that's going on in this discussion, though, that we're dipping our toes into, is how we can distinguish science from non-science, or science from pseudo or junk science. This is called the demarcation problem. And what's at stake is which beliefs are epistemically warranted. That is, when you've got a belief in your head about the way the world is or why it is that way, which ones have this warrant, this certification that, yes, this is actually the way it is, and which ones are fairy tale or make-believe or just simply not true. So I listed some examples here. Astrology versus astronomy, say, right? Economics, a long-standing discussion. Is this a science? In what ways is it a science? What parts of it is science? Creationism or intelligent design in conversations with evolutionary theory, right? So you see this pop up into social debates, and it's a long-standing philosophical debate. Now, you would need some criteria to demarcate something. That's to say, this goes in the science box and this goes in the non-science box or in a pseudoscience box. So what are the criteria that you use to determine which box you're going to put something in? This too has a long-standing philosophic discussion. Some people known as the logical positivists, early mid-20th century, said it's verification. Science is a way of accessing reality and inquiring that is minimal to verifying the statements that it makes, right? So if it's a verifiable statement, it's scientific. Well, then Karl Popper kind of grew out of that movement and said, no, scientific statements aren't verifiable, they're falsifiable. Many scientists today, by the way, I think hold on to this definition of what they're doing, what demarcates what they're doing from a non-scientific field, is that what they're doing is testable and falsifiable. Others would say, no, it's really important that what counts as science is anything that can be reproduced. I don't know about that, though, because geological sciences often are conducting studies and coming to insights and truths that aren't necessarily reproducible, at least not in a strict laboratory sense of that term. And then others say, look, science is anything that is engaged in puzzle solving in a way that can lead to progress. And progress can be understood as greater explanatory power, greater scope of explanation, more consistent internal adherence of the beliefs that are in the structure of that science, the simplicity of the theories of that science, or these kind of criteria of what progress would mean. But science would be anything that can make progress along these lines and help solve puzzles. Now, why does all this matter? Well, think about it. If you get sick, who do you want to see to help diagnose and treat that problem? Well, hopefully somebody who's well-grounded in the science, right? So it's important for healthcare. It's important for environmental regulations that these be scientifically based. Expert testimony, say in court cases. For our educational system, what are we going to teach in the public schools? Journalism, what are we going to report on? How are we going to represent science and these debates about what's going to count as the science? So the demarcation problem, although you could say this is kind of a woolly philosophical debate, it has very real world implications for what gets power, what gets listened to, who gets power, and who gets listened to in society. I'd like you to channel the spirit of Albert Einstein, who always connected science with creativity. And let's be a little creative and multiply the ways that we can see science. I think many of you might say your first intuition of science is this method, right? We all learned that in high school, the scientific method about formulating a hypothesis and testing it. True enough, right? In fact, there's many methods in science and processes. But it's more than that. You also have, you might think, well, all the things that are in the textbooks, right? The body of laws and knowledge and theories that have accumulated over time. Newton said, if I have seen further, it's only because I stood on the shoulders of giants, meaning I didn't have to start from step zero. We're a social learning species. So every generation can kind of pick up where the last one left off because we have this body of knowledge. Science is also very human in social practice in ways that we'll talk a lot about in this course, including scientific institutions. Scientists serve as experts and are granted certain privileged standing in society. Things we'll talk about a bit in our lecture about democracy in science. And again, science is a monolithic term, and in some ways that's appropriate to think about. There is something that makes science science, right? But also sciences in the plural is important to keep in mind. Even in something I study a lot, climate change, climate science is actually a whole bunch of sciences: biogeochemistry, paleoclimatology, ecology, right? All of these are coming together. And they all have different methods and theories. What about science? Modern science as a worldview that tells you what exists, right? What the furniture of the world, from atoms on up to the universe. It structures kind of our basic assumptions about what is in the world and how it works. We live in a world now of oxygen and the periodic table of elements, not in a world of dephlogisticated air. It wasn't that long ago that people had that worldview. And in a way, science is intuitive. Science is, you could just say, a precisioning of our already, the way we already are able to make sense of the world. We already work in an intelligible world. We know that things fall when we drop them. We expect that to happen. We know the trees bloom in the spring. We expect that to happen. The kids grow up to adults and it doesn't go the other way. It doesn't go backwards. We already have this intelligibility in our world, and science just makes that more precise and explains it and knits it all together. But also science is non-intuitive. The table I'm sitting at, right, I think I said this earlier, is composed of 99% empty space. There's a virus, right, that we can't see that's causing people to get sick. So it also can be that science challenges our intuitive way of taking up with the world, and this can cause, as we'll see, conflicts and questions about ethics. Finally, we've talked about, hey, science and technology are linked. Science is applied technology, technology is applied science. Okay. Now, in your textbook, in a part that I'm not requiring you to read, but I did want to pull this out for you to know and think about. These different ways of seeing modern science in relationship with different parts of culture. And this is from a guy named Ian Barber. And I just wanted to have his four threefold framework in mind. And then I'm added a fifth one to think about. So he said there's really four kinds of relationships between science and other kinds of parts of culture. So that could be religion, it could be the law, it could be educational systems, it could be the military, the media, right? So how does science relate to these other facets of culture? Well, the first one would be independence. I put NOMA here, just an acronym for non-overlapping magisteria. In other words, let's just treat science as completely independent. It's a totally different thing, and it's autonomous, and it doesn't touch anything else. Okay, so one formulation of this is that science tells us how the heavens go. In other words, how comets and suns and planets move around. But it doesn't tell us how to go to heaven, right? That's the magisteria or the domain or the turf or the territory of religion. And science is totally different. So that's one way to think about these relationships. I don't want to evaluate these, just kind of lay them out for you. Conflict is another kind of relationship between science and other parts of culture. I mean, I'm thinking of the creationism debates as one of them in the public schools. Historically, though, Galileo is the locus classicus of this in his conflict with the Catholic Church. There's also dialogue, though, and sometimes really interesting, productive dialogue. I mentioned here the Dalai Lama in neuroscience. In fact, many Buddhists are very interested in working with neuroscientists to look at what's going on in the brain when you meditate. And they're very willing to take up the scientific insights about that process into their meditative practices. And the scientists, in turn, many of them, are very interested in learning about Buddhism and meditation and ways it might illuminate their science. So there can be really interesting dialogues, too. And then there can be just full-on integration. And in many ways, I think philosophy is a story of science smushing into other parts of culture. I listed just a couple here. Hume and others really wanted to make ethics scientific, right? Or political philosophy. So they looked at the success of the sciences in the natural world and they said, we can do that. We can just make a human science, basically. And that's what this political philosophy will be. I mentioned Goethe too. He's in the book. And the Romantics, who are sometimes characterized as anti-science, but they're not against all science. They were just against a kind of reductionistic form of science. And Goethe, for example, took color theory. And I listed phenomenology here because he wanted to develop a science that took the humanistic lived experience of colors, say, and integrate that with what we knew about color theory, say from Newton and prisms and rainbows that he was creating, to develop an integrated human natural understanding of colors. Finally, this is my own addition because I'm thinking about the coronavirus pandemic, for example. It seems to me that science also just gets mangled in ways that can't quite fit into any one of these categories. The way the media takes up the epidemiology and the way this gets handled in the politics, I guess what I mean by mangle is it's some of all of this. You know, there's conflict, there's attempts to have independence. I mean, for goodness sakes, we can't have a Republican epidemiology and a Democrat epidemiology. We need to keep partisan politics separate from science, right? But then there is conflict going on between different experts and between experts and decision makers. There's lots of dialogue going on. There's integration happening. And then there's also just disinformation and fake news and you name it. It's just a mess or a mangle, right? And part of this course is to help us think through that. Okay, getting towards the end here. We're going to go on to more norms, and I'll talk about that term a bit. Let's just say it basically means rules. And we're going to focus more on, I guess, what we call ethical norms with Merton, although maybe those are still epistemic norms. Again, ethical about how we should act. Epistemic is about knowledge and what counts as knowledge. Like I said earlier, think back to the leopard getting spots. You know, Rudyard Kipling's story about getting painted. doesn't have to be justified. But science does, as a non-narrative rationality. You always get to say, prove it, right? Or maybe disprove it if you're into the falsifiability theory. How do you know it? And maybe this is in some way the difference between revelation or faith on one hand and reason on the other. Because it's not good enough to just say, well, you have to have faith. So you can always ask, why? How do you know it, right? Why is it that way? So in asking those questions, what you're asking for is, what are the rules or norms that we need to follow to generate knowledge that has an epistemic warrant, that is, that's credible or it's legitimate or it's real, right? And what is the status of that knowledge, right? So there's two ways of thinking about these epistemic norms. One is the process itself. So you're asking, what are the rules or norms governing the creation of knowledge? Again, it's a non-narrative rationality. You can't just pull it out of thin air and make it up out of your head. There's got to be something about, well, the way you observe and record your observations, the way you relate your observations to your hypotheses and your theories, right? So these would be the epistemic norms. I put an example here, inductive reasoning. What are the rules for inferring or drawing out general conclusions or generalizations from specific observations? That's a big question in science. There's also then norms in the structure of the knowledge that is created. So there's a process of creating it and then the structure of the knowledge. What makes scientific knowledge scientific? And I just list one answer here. The deductive nomenological model. This is Newton's cannonball. It's a good example. So the deductive nomenological model, which is hard to say, just says that a scientific form of knowledge is one that subsumes individual phenomena under general covering laws. So like F equals ma. So the cannonball is like the moon. They're both specific instances of the same laws in operation. Newton said if we shot a cannonball hard enough, it would actually leave the Earth's gravitational pull and start to orbit just like the moon. And in that way, we can see that whether it's a tennis ball or a cannonball or a moon or a sun or whatever, it can all be subsumed under, covered by these laws. And that's the deductive nomenological model. That's just one example of this way of saying that's what makes scientific knowledge scientific. So again, this is back to the demarcation problem. What is a scientific body of knowledge? Well, it would be a body of knowledge on this theory that is full of these covering laws, and every specific instance can be referred back to and explained by one of those covering laws. Okay, last slide here, because we're going to get to this. This is really our next talk. There are social and ethical norms in science as well, not just epistemic norms. So science is not value-free. You already see there's values epistemically in science. You can't just make up stories, right? So already there's sort of value judgments making up science. One way to put it, Jacob Bernowski said, is we ought to act in such a way that what is true can be verified to be so. In other words, this whole fact-value dichotomy, as if facts were value-free, you actually have to have certain values in order to get the facts. You have to be honest and tell the truth, right? You have to follow these rules of the process of finding knowledge. So norms, ethics are written into the heart of science. That's like one of the key conclusions or messages of this course, right? There you go, right? The very practice of science presupposes and requires ethical norms. Ethics is in science. Now that only gets us started because we now have to think, well, what kind of ethics is in science? And isn't there some way science should be value-free? Yeah, so there's still more thinking to be done. And that will then get us to these bigger questions about what is the scope of scientists' responsibility. So that points us into further modules of this course. But that's enough for now. Akbar was loving this stuff. He was getting a little crazy and thought of this gem. My science brings all the humanoids in the yard. Damn right, it's better than yours. That's Akbar, space cowboy, and there he is. Also big fan of our Earth music here. All right, well, until next time, may the force